In this video, we're going to talk about canvases. In particular, we're going to see some of the reasons why this type of support has become so popular in the oil painting. We're going to talk about its anatomy, describing its components, and pointing out problems and criteria to choose them. At the end, we're going to see two examples on how to mount and prime a canvas. The most important reason why the canvas has become so popular in the art history is because it allows us making artworks large and light at the same time. Another important reason is because it can make the transport easier. First because of the weight, but also because for low valuable paintings, the canvas can be taken off from its frame and roll it down in a sort of tube that make its transport easier and safer at the same time. In some cases, the frame itself can be disassembled and easily transported together with the canvas, or it can be changed with a new one once the painting reaches its destination. The cost is another important advantage. In fact, not all the painters can afford to work on more expensive supports. The canvas can be easily brought back to its flat shape. If properly primed, it represents a rigid and flexible support at the same time, allowing the painting to resist to mechanical stresses and to atmospheric changes. If stored in a proper way, the canvas can last for a very long time. Let's start to see now its main components. Of course, there is the canvas itself, which, as we have seen, is composed by the fabric and the primer. The canvas hangs on a frame, and most of the time it gets fixed using staples or nails. Since we have already seen the priming process, here we're going to talk only about the fabrics. There are three parameters that allow us to choose between them, and they are the material, the texture, and the weight. Traditionally, the canvases were only naturals, but now we can also find them made in synthetic or natural mixed synthetic. The most used naturals are cotton and linen, which is the German name of the flax. Sometimes they also use hessian or hemp. Synthetic materials are not really common in oil painting, but we can still find them. The most used is the polyester, very frequently mixed with cotton. The texture depends on the size, shape, and the number of threads used for warp and weft, and on the distance between them. The weight is normally given in grams per square meter, and most of the time defines how robust is the fabric. It should refer to the raw one, but in case of pre-primed canvas, it may refer to the processed one. So it's better for us to make clear this matter before we buy a pre-primed canvas. Normally, the weight for a raw canvas suitable for oil painting starts from 150 grams per square meter for the thin one, up to 450 grams per square meter for the thick one, and sometimes even more. It's a good habit to increase the weight of the fabric with the size of the canvas. Normally, for the most common sizes found on the market, a good weight could go from 250 to 350 grams per square meter. The problem is that it's difficult to find a heavy canvas with a fine texture. So, if we like a fine texture, probably we have to compromise on the weight. The material and the texture are very personal choices, but the weight is something that we shouldn't underestimate. because at the end is one of the things that will define how long our painting will last. Let's start to talk now about the frames. The most common parameters to choose between them are the material, the size, including the thickness, the shape, the structure, and if it has or not a stretching system. The most used material by far to make the frames is the wood. Also in this case they use different timbers. It's really important that the wood used for this application had a good seasoning and that it's light and stiff at the same time. The most common wood used is the pine, but occasionally we can find others, most of all on high quality or on customized frames. Recently they have also started to use the aluminium, most of the time combined with wood. The aluminium allowed to the structure to add very advanced stretching systems. The most traditional stretching system is made with wedges. In this case, using a hammer, we have to push the wedge inside the slot in the corner that joins the two beams of the frame. While it gets inside, the wedge pushes the beam out perpendicularly to its penetration direction. If we repeat this for all the four corners of the frame, we should be able to give a good stretch to our canvas. The most traditional shapes are rectangular or square, but we can find oval and rounded canvases as well. But they have used very strange shapes. In fact, it's one of the artist's prerogatives to choose the dimension and the shape of his paintings. A good frame structure is very important because it will ensure to our canvas to be flat and shaped for a long time. In the long period, a poorly designed frame will definitely cause some problem to the painting. We have to remember that one of the advantages to use the canvas for our paintings is that it's light. So theoretically, the best frame is the one that will ensure to our canvas the maximum stability and the lowest weight. Here we're going to see four of the most common problems that we can eventually have if we poorly design our frame and what we have to do in order to avoid them. The first problem is caused by the canvas tension. As we said, in order to have a flat painting, we have to stretch it. And this means that the canvas will constantly pull on the external beams of our frame. In the long period, under a constant traction, these beams may eventually bend in the center direction. To avoid this problem, there are two things that we can do. The first is to increase the beam's thickness, mostly longitudinally to the canvas traction. And the second is to add some extra beam in the middle. This kind of structure becomes really important if we work on large canvases. The second problem that we may encounter is if the frame itself changes its shape. For example, if it turns from a rectangle to a parallelogram. Theoretically, this shouldn't happen on a mounted canvas because the canvas itself should be able to pull back and keep the frame in shape, most of all if the stress is small. But it's always better to stretch the canvas only longitudinally to its warp and weft and not diagonally because in this direction the canvas is actually easily deformable. There is also the chance when we mount a canvas, mostly if it's a large one, that without noticing it turns to be not perfectly rectangular. This happens normally if we are not really expert, and we will notice that we made a mistake when we go to frame the painting. To add this problem, we could use different types of brackets. But in this case, it's really difficult to set a stretching system. Another problem that we may encounter, most of all on large supports, is that the canvas more or less slightly twists. And if we hang our work on a wall, we can immediately see the problem. This can happen because the frame is too thin, and when we mount the canvas on it, the tension twists it. It can happen because one or more beams junctions are lax, and sometimes because our wooden beams are not perfectly straight. So it's always a good habit to give a bit of thickness to the frame, most of all if it's large, to try to avoid clearance between the junctions, and to check very carefully the wood before we decide to use it for our frame. The last problem that we may have is if the frame marks the canvas. This problem can start when we prime it, and it may go on when we paint it. To avoid it, we have to leave enough room between the internal corner of the beam and the canvas. In this way, when our brush will push the canvas down, it will not touch the frame. Here we can see two very used beam sections that allow us to avoid this problem. The first, which is also the oldest, has a sharp edge which in the long period could be a problem for the canvas, while the second is more rounded and probably represents the best solution. To fix the canvas on the frame, traditionally they used to do it with nails. Now, fortunately, we can use steeples that are much easier to handle thanks to the steeple gun. But there are other systems out there where we don't have to punch the canvas and the frame. There are two methods to fix the canvas to the frame. In the first, which is also the most traditional, we fix the canvas on the external perimeter of the frame, while in the second we fix it behind it. In the first case, we can only work on the front, while in the second case, if we want, we can continue our painting also on the external perimeter. This second method has an advantage. In fact, with the first, it's better to frame the painting before we hang it on our wall, while with the second, we don't really need an external frame, although if we want it, we can still use one. It's time now to see how to mount and prime a canvas. Here we're going to see only the second way, so we're going to fix the canvas on the back of the frame. As first, we have to identify which face of the frame is going to be on the canvas side. Then we're going to fix our canvas on one of the sides, making sure that warp and weft are parallel or perpendicular to the beam. Since the other end of the canvas is free, we don't need to stretch it. Using our steeple gun, we're going to nail it to the frame right in the middle of the beam. We are going to do the same with the opposite beam, but this time we're going to stretch the canvas before we nail it. And in the same way, we're going to fix also the other two remaining sides, so that at the end the center of our canvas is stretched in 4 directions. Now we're going to work on the corners, stretching the canvas in both directions and nail it on both sizes. We're going to make sure when we work on the corners to pull the canvas enough to stretch it without deforming the frame. We have to repeat this operation for all the 4 corners. When also this part is complete, we have to start nailing the rest of the canvas. At the end, when it's completely fixed, one at a time, we're going to bend the canvas on the corners and fix it also there. Once the nailing job is complete and the canvas is fixed on the frame, If we want, we can cut the extra fabric off. We don't really need to stretch the canvas too much because now we're going to prime it, and as all the natural fibers once wet, it's going to shrink. Now, using a brush, we're going to give a first coat of primer. It's important that we make sure that it gets absorbed and it's uniform all over the painting surface. And if we like it, we can also prime on the sides. In this way, we can also paint there if we want. My suggestion is to prime also on the stipples. In this way, the canvas becomes stronger, and over the time, the tension of them doesn't risk to break it. Now that we have completed the first coat, we must wait until it's dry. My suggestion, if we have time, is to wait at least 24 hours before we give the second coat. If we want, we can give more than 2 layers. If it's possible, always trying to wait at least 24 hours between them. In alternative to the brush, to prime our canvas, we can use a spatula. In this way, at the end, it should be smoother. If we want to mount on the frame a pre-primed canvas that we can do by ourselves or we can buy on the market, the procedure is almost the same. The only difference is that this type of canvas is a little bit more difficult to stretch by hand, so we may want to use stretching pliers. In this way, we can leverage on the frame and stretch the canvas in a better way. And with this last suggestion, we have concluded our discussion on the canvases. If you enjoyed this video, we will really appreciate if you could click on like and subscribe to our channel. It will also help us very much if you could leave a comment. Thank you for watching this video and see you in the next one.